On this occasion, I'd like to stay in the Old Testament book of Numbers. We've previously talked about some of the events in chapter 13 and 14. This time I want to talk about chapter 16. What happens when you have somebody that is obsessed with power, greedy for power, but wants to blame somebody else for all the problems that they see? Interesting questions. The chapter 16 of Numbers begins this way. It talks about Korah. Korah, who is actually, in his genealogy in verse 1, is related, he's of the tribe of Levi, as are Moses and Aaron. Korah is related in a distant way to Moses and Aaron, but he's still related. And yet he wants the power, he wants the authority, he wants the responsibility, he wants the prestige that you find Moses and Aaron actually possessing. So in the very beginning of verse number 2, Korah, Dathan, Abiram, a lot of other individuals involved in verse number 1, rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel. Rose up is a Hebrew word that carries with it an idea of a confrontation that is really not a polite meeting. There's an agitation that goes along with it. In fact, the Greek word before, they rose up before Moses, carries with it the idea of face. It's almost like it's saying, these individuals are actually getting in the face of Moses because of the way they disagree with things that are taking place. And it's not just the individuals that are listed in verse number 1. The statement is made in verse number 2 that they also had 250 leaders of Israel with them, representatives of the congregation, men of renown, men of importance, men who are respected. And in verse number 3, they are saying to Moses and Aaron, you take too much upon yourselves. Isn't that kind of a presumptuous statement? You got too much authority. All the congregation is holy, all the children of Israel holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Maybe because God has made this statement and Moses is the one that's been chosen to lead the nation out of Egyptian bondage. Where have these people been when that's been taking place? Have they been oblivious to God's choice for the one who's actually leading them out of the servitude that they have been in for 400 years? So statement's made in verse number 4. When Moses hears it, he falls on his face. Why are these individuals doing this? And really the indication in verse 3, there's a tremendous amount of envy. We want the power that you possess. After all, every member of Israel, every child of Israel is holy. The whole congregation of Israel is holy. So why do you exalt yourself? He didn't. God did. There's a statement that's made down in verse number 8 through verse number 11. Moses, talking to Korah, says this: Is it a small thing to you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the work of the tabernacle of the Lord, to stand before the congregation to serve him? What's he saying? Within that tribe of Levi, although Aaron and his sons were actually the priests, other families in that tribe of Levi had some very astute responsibilities concerning the worship of Israel, the tabernacle itself. Korah is involved in that kind of process with that kind of responsibility. And the statement is finally made, a question asked in verse number 10 by Moses to Korah: Are you also seeking the priesthood? Can't you be satisfied with the responsibility that God's given you? Envy, greed, hungry for power. In verse number 12, Moses actually wants to meet with all of them. He sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and they said, we're not going to come. We're not going to show up. So Moses has had this conversation with Korah, but the other individuals that are really behind this kind of rebellion, they don't want to show up. We have nothing to talk about. We're not going to listen to what you have to say. It's our way or no way. It's kind of an ancient aspect of trying to cancel culture in Numbers chapter 16. We're not going to listen. We're not going to come to you. We're not going to talk about it. We've made up our mind. And here's the statement that follows from these individuals rebelling against Moses and Aaron. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? Verse 13. So what they're saying is, and it's a play on words, remember the spies that came back from 40 days in that promised land to see what it was like, and they came back and said, it's beyond what we would have imagined. It is a land that flows with milk and honey. The accusation against Moses at this point is, you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to die in the wilderness. You brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness. The land flowing with milk and honey was the land in which you were slaves? Does that make any sense? As far as they're concerned, it makes perfect sense. They continue in verse number 14, moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. Oh, where were they when the spies came back? The spies said, this is a land that flows with milk and honey. And their accusation is, you've not brought us into that land that flows with milk and honey. Whose fault is that? 10 of those spies didn't believe they had the power to take it. They forgot about God. Only Joshua and Caleb said, yes, we can do this. And the nation of Israel listens to the 10 spies, including Korah and Dathan and Abiram and all of these individuals that now want to rebel against Moses. They are involved in that crowd also. They said, we just can't take this land. We can't do this. And God says, you will die in the wilderness because of that lack of belief. Your children will inherit that land. You will not. But to say that, Moses, you haven't done this, or Moses, you're presuming too much, to be that willfully oblivious to the facts is phenomenal. It's actually pathetic. But these individuals aren't to be pitied. They bring it upon themselves. Back in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron actually are questioning the authority of Moses. It did not turn out too well for them. And here, these individuals are trying to do the same thing. Short-term memory loss. That's not something that's just developed in our 21st century or 20th century, because it's still around today. It goes back, way back in antiquity. Individuals that are so greedy for power that they forget principles that really kind of monitor their existence. They forget who they are and where they are. They actually have this fabricated fantasy of what it used to be like. Let's go back to the way things were. Let's go back to Egypt. They would have liked, in chapter 14, to have chosen somebody to have led them back to slavery from whence they came. Problematic ideology of wanting more and more power and blaming somebody else. Moses, you haven't brought us into this land that flows with milk and honey. That's not Moses' fault. You are the ones that said we can't do this. People that do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. It happens over and over and over again. Korah, Dathan, those that were instigators in this rebellion, ultimately by the end of this chapter, lose their life because of all of those injustices that they are inflicting upon what God has actually put in place. They're leading the nation of Israel astray. Surely they know better. Why would they forget? But it seems like they have. We want your power, and it's not our fault that we can't go in the promised land. We'll blame you, even though we said we cannot do it. Humanity really hasn't changed. Pray for the nation. Pray that lessons from history can be learned in such a way that we don't repeat these same mistakes. Hungry for power, never a good thing. Blaming somebody else for one's own mistakes, never justifiable either. Interesting chapter, Numbers chapter 16. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.